So more about viruses. This time, let's talk about the misconceptions and misinformation about the history of viral disease in our modern world. So it's too much to cover the history of all viruses right now. We're going to focus on something that we know a little better, like the flu, influenza, the flu. And we're going to talk about this more than animal diseases because it's harder to track animal diseases. A lot of animals, if they got sick and died of something 50 years ago, they just died at home on the farm. They didn't go to the vet. There's no public records of what they died from. With humans, we have a lot of public records, public health records about what they died from and when. So we're going to talk about those, even though it's all the same, whether it's your pets or the people. All these viruses come from environmental influences. So if the pets are dying of a virus or the humans are dying of a virus, it's all the same stuff in the end. So I'm going to start off right before the flu pandemic that most of us remember. So 1875. 1875 is when we had started really rolling out a lot of telegraph wires all over the country for communication. That's the first time in the modern medical literature that we see neurasthenia. So neurasthenia is a disease of nerves or in sensation. So it's like tingling and prickling and itchy feeling. It's ringing in the ears. It's what we today call chronic fatigue syndrome, of just being lethargic and low on energy, and you go to the doctor and they can't find anything wrong with you. And you just don't ever feel good. You don't have energy. That's neurasthenia. And that was first really noticed when we started putting a lot of electricity in the atmosphere with telegraph wires in 1875. So with regard to flu, 1889 marks really the beginning of the modern electrical era, when we were really putting electricity on city streets with electric streetlights in big towns and electricity in the homes. That's when that really took off, about 1889. Well, there was a flu pandemic at the same time. It lasted for about 5 years. It struck unpredictably all over the planet at the same time. It was in Asia, it was in Europe, it was in the US. It was happening at the same time. It wasn't happening a month or two apart where there was time for somebody in one area of the world to travel by sea or by horse and buggy or train or whatever to some other part of the country. It didn't spread in a wave. It popped up everywhere at the same time because everybody was putting electricity in their cities at the same time. Okay. Then the next big one, 1918, during World War I, there was the big Spanish flu outbreak. So people will argue, well, the military was traveling all over the world at that time, so they were taking the flu with them and spreading it. And they'll say because a lot of the flu started on military bases. Well, 1918, we rolled out a ton of new AM radio. Remember old school AM radio and FM radio? AM radio is a long wavelength, here on this chart, long wavelength, travels really far, has a really long, tall antenna. That was being pumped out all over the world for military communication, for warfare, and just for overall communication and radio broadcasts. That's why Spanish flu popped up everywhere all at the same time. And that's why members of the military seemed to get it worse than others, because they were right there where the big antennas were being built on military bases. And then they were malnourished and stressed, with war. So their immune systems were down also. So they got it really bad. That was the big EMR of the day with the long wavelength, traveling really far. The next big one, kind of in modern history, 1957, there was another big flu outbreak. That's when we started pumping out radar everywhere. Radar, because it was just the newest technology of the day as we were getting more advanced. And this is Cold War era. So we're putting out radar stations everywhere to scan the horizon for nuclear missiles to be coming in from Russia. There was a DEW line, DEW, distant early warning. So there's a line of radar stations across northern Canada scanning the environment in case there's a Russian nuclear missile comes sailing over the North Pole to get us. So radar is everywhere. And along with it came a flu pandemic. 10 years later, 1968, we started putting a lot of satellites in the atmosphere. We actually were putting some satellites in the atmosphere before 1968, but 1968 we put out a lot more and we kind of turned them all on at the same time. They're in the Van Allen belts. You can look those up. The Van Allen belts are electrically charged. They collect a lot of energy from the sun. They're full of electrons. And actually, if you look them up, you'll see information that they're damaging to the sensitive electronics in satellites. But the opposite is much more important to us. The satellites are disrupting the electrical configuration of the Van Allen belts, and that affects all life on Earth, us, plants, trees, everything. So in 1968, flu pandemic, we put a bunch of satellites in the atmosphere. So all these, we've introduced new electromagnetic radiation into the atmosphere they're all immediately followed by a flu outbreak, okay? That's the way it is, okay? Don't let anybody tell you differently, because you can look this up. That's the way it is. So we'll fast forward a little bit. More recently, 96, 97, end of 96, Christmas 96 season, we already had some cell phones in the 80s and 90s and car phones. You remember those. But in the end of 96, for Christmas of 96, everything went digital, okay? Everything changed then. So remember SARS and MERS, and they were going to kill us all and all these things. This new digital cell phone technology rolled out in all the big cities. It was sometime in November, I don't remember the exact date, but for the 3 to 7 or 10% of the human population who are really sensitive to EMFs and EMRs, they know the exact time and date in November when the digital cell phone network got turned on. Because since then, for the rest of their lives, they've had ringing in their ears and tingling skin and chronic fatigue issues. They know exactly when it was turned on at 2 a.m. that night or whatever. So it's affecting us all. Just because we don't notice it with the ringing ears, it's still affecting ourselves, okay? So then fast forward to just the past few years, the newest cell phone technology is the 5G, and it's associated with also a lot of military stuff. So it's in the 30 to maybe up to the 100 gigahertz range. These millimeter waves are small enough that they can affect things in our body and our cell membranes. They affect the permeability of our cell membranes. And we've got trillions of cells in our body, and they all use water, the positive and negative side of water, to control what comes in and out of the cells. So that membrane is disrupted by all this electromagnetic stuff. It's been disrupted since we first introduced electricity. That's why we get flu and we get sick, because there's a disruption. But the newer 5G stuff with millimeter waves gets into our cells even more. September 26th of 2019, so COVID-19, September 26th of 2019 in Wuhan, China, 5G was turned on. And then they upped it February 13th of 2020. They turned on their traffic monitoring 5G network, and there was another big spike in COVID cases. And lockdowns all over the world started that month or right after. March of 2020 is when it really hit here. So this COVID thing, it's got nothing to do with wet markets or biomedical military warfare research labs. Now, of course, if you're trying to take some disease or something and make it worse for military warfare, that's terrible, and that's, super dangerous. That's full of egotistical hubris, and I'm against it, of course. And I'm sure those wet markets are full of nasty, inhumane disease, and they're probably full of really bad bacteria, and you can get really, really sick there. But that's not where the viruses come from, and that's not where COVID came from. It came from the 5G being turned on, the new EMF introduced in the atmosphere. Just like in 1918, we turned on a lot of AM radio EMF that made everybody sick in 1918. So you kind of know most of the rest of the history, but there's a few pieces you may not know. Fall of 2019, 5G was turned on in Manhattan and downtown, all the big downtown areas. Interestingly, the most dense coverage was in northern Italy, where a lot of people were more sick. Also, interestingly, these 5G millimeter waves, they're really, really short and small. They're short and small so they can get into your cells and into your body and do more damage, but they don't travel through walls and trees and things very well. Whereas these AM signals that are really big and long, they can travel all over the world. That's why you can tune in an old car radio to AM station and pick up something hundreds of miles away. But these smaller millimeter waves, they don't travel through things very well. That's why the 5G network is on, street posts, light posts. It's everywhere. They have to put it everywhere because it's blocked by buildings and stuff. So there's some research being done back in fall of 2019, or actually early 2020, in Kirkland, Washington. So there's a company called Pivotal Comware, and they're testing something called Echo 5G in-building penetration device to try to get the 5G to go through buildings better, because it's not good at that. So this company who's testing new equipment and trying to figure out how to get the 5G to be stronger is a mile, approximately, from the Life Care nursing home in Kirkland, Washington, which was where COVID-19 hit first in the United States, or where we first identified it and talked about it in March of 2020. It was already happening in the big cities. They just hadn't figured it out yet. And then we went on lockdown. Also, interestingly, or anecdotally maybe for now, I don't have the proof of this, the Diamond Princess cruise line. Remember that cruise ship that was quarantined at sea for weeks and weeks and weeks, and 300 some people were sick? they advertise that they have the best Wi-Fi at sea. Now, that's interesting. So, point is, the current illnesses we're still experiencing, today's November 1st of 2023, and all the variants we've seen since 2020, they're all responses to the activation of more and more rollout of this latest generation of cell phone and communication technology. It's heavily deployed around schools. So think of this, most schools are public schools. They're owned by the city or the county. Well, there's usually a big cell phone or microwave communication tower right there on the school property because the county owns it. So they put all their police and fire department and public works communications on there, which that makes sense, sure. But all that 5G and all that cell phone stuff is right there where the kids are at school. It's also in the more popular downtown areas and trendy urban hotspots. It's at busy roads and intersections for traffic monitoring and for self-driving car-to-car communication. So it's everywhere, and it's rolling out all the time, amplifying it, all these things. So we keep getting these variants of this recent disease. You don't necessarily have to take my word for this, though. All this information is in public records. You can find it if you look hard enough. It's not easy to find on mainstream media and the mainstream search sites, but it is all out there. So there's also thousands of books about this stuff over 100 years or more. But there's two books, let me mention real quick, that really tied this all together for me more recently. So The Contagion Myth by Dr. Thomas Cowan and The Invisible Rainbow by Arthur Furstenberg, they clearly demonstrate the timeline and the reasoning and the science, everything you want to know. They clearly tie it all together, especially both of those books. That flu and COVID are absolutely caused by these profound disturbances of the electrical envelope, like the Van Allen belts of the Earth. It's all created by modern man and modern technologies. So I want to finish up with, we need to change our thinking when we hear the word virus, because we've got the cause and effect backwards when we think of viruses. The viruses aren't the cause of disease. They're part of the disease process. They're the effect of the thing that's causing the disease. We just have this all backwards. The viruses aren't causing it. The viruses are happening because of it. All viruses are either this electromagnetic energy interference, because all plants and animals and birds rely on electromagnetic fields with the earth, or they're toxic chemicals. Okay, we didn't get into that yet. All the other viruses we haven't mentioned, like measles and polio, are toxic chemicals. We're going to do another video on that soon. And whether it's toxic chemicals or EMF, these viruses are not eradicated by vaccines. Okay, vaccines don't do it. Vaccines aren't working. Vaccines don't make any sense. They're eradicated because we either start adapting the toxins, which is what the viruses are supposed to help us do, or we remove the toxins from the environment. So we need separate videos about those. I think we've got more than enough now, so let's stop here. Thanks.